By the end of his life, Henry VIII was a grotesque spectacle, a swollen giant whose rotting body burst inside its coffin. But that is not where the story begins. To understand the fall, you must first see the rise, when he seemed England's golden hope. In 1509, at just 17, Henry Tudor became King Henry VIII. He was not simply another monarch stepping into place. He was a revelation. At 6 feet 2, towering over most of his court, he was built like a knight from the romances he adored. His auburn hair caught the sun, his face shone with youth, and his long limbs moved with athletic confidence. Compared to the grey suspicion of his father, Henry VII, the sun was dazzling. Henry VII had been thin, cautious, more clerk than warrior. His rule had been steady but cold, cemented by calculation and paranoia. The boy who replaced him was the opposite, broad-shouldered, restless, loud, eager to perform. Where the father's court had felt like an accountant's chamber, the son's quickly became a theatre, alive with music, tournaments, masks, and hunting parties. And as dazzling as this theatre seemed, it carried a darker irony. The body that looked immortal would one day collapse in ways no king could disguise. If you're fascinated by how royal bodies became theatres of power, dazzling in youth, grotesque in decline, make sure to subscribe to Shrouded History. Here, kings and queens shine like gods, only to be undone by the very flesh that crowned them. From the first days of his reign, Henry made his body the argument for kingship. At dawn he hunted, his dogs tearing through Windsor's forests as he spurred his horse over rough ground. By afternoon he was in armour, charging down the tiltyard with lance lowered, splinters flying as wood shattered on impact. At night he danced in great halls until the wax ran low, his laughter echoing under gilded rafters. The body did not seem to tire, though in time it would betray him more cruelly than any rival ever could. Foreign envoys took note. The Venetian ambassador called him the handsomest potentate I have ever set eyes on. The French compared him to Apollo. Others marveled that a single man could ride, sing, compose, argue theology, and command a feast in the same day. England had produced not just a king but a spectacle, a monarch who seemed carved for admiration. In these first years, his court lived at his pace. Minstrels played his songs, scholars debated with him, courtiers tried and failed to match him in sport. He played tennis with a ferocity that sent balls cracking against stone walls. He fenced with lightning speed, demanding rematches until he was satisfied. He devoured feasts, then rose early to hunt again. To those around him, it was not gluttony or excess but sheer vitality. The people of London adored him. When he processed through the streets, banners streaming overhead, crowds surged forward for a glimpse. They saw a monarch who looked indestructible, a body that stood taller, moved quicker, and laughed louder than any man in the crowd. After decades of civil war, Henry himself seemed to promise stability, not through policy, but through presence. Yet presence can turn to weight, and weight to burden. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon strengthened the image. Their wedding that summer filled the city with celebration, tournaments, pageants, feasts. The Queen, regal and devout, charmed England quickly. Together they appeared as a fairy tale pair, she bringing the dignity of Spain, he the vigor of England. For a kingdom weary of bloodshed, the match seemed proof that a golden age had arrived. But no fairy tale lasts forever. It was the tiltyard that made Henry immortal in his people's eyes. Clad in armour polished until it blazed in the sun, mounted on destriers covered in royal cloth, he thundered down the lists. Lances splintered on his breastplate, opponents reeled backward, and the crowd roared. When Henry lifted his visor, flushed from exertion and smiling at his victory, it was as though the nation itself had triumphed. In the evenings, the pageantry continued at table. The kitchens of Hampton Court poured out roasted boars, glazed pies, and rivers of ale. Henry presided not like a man, but like a fountain of abundance. He ate with joy, drank deeply, and still had the energy to leap to his feet when the music began. His appetite, his laughter, his stamina, all of it became evidence that the Tudors were chosen, that God himself had blessed this king. Few noticed how appetite can in time become devouring. To his courtiers, Henry's body was not private flesh. It was England's crown made visible. His height, his skill, his vigour, were treated as symbols of divine favour. Every triumph in the hunt, every victory in the tiltyard, every flourish of song or dance was more than entertainment. It was legitimacy. The kingdom did not just believe in his rule, they believed in him, and for a time, that belief was justified. Henry's youth was dazzling, his energy unmatched, his charisma undeniable. The prince who became king seemed to promise a reign of splendor, a golden chapter for England after years of turmoil. But golden flesh corrodes. No one then imagined that the very body which made him adored would, in the years ahead, turn against him, swelling, splitting, stinking, and finally bursting in a coffin that could not hold him. The early Tudor court revolved around Henry, like planets around a sun. Wherever he moved, the atmosphere shifted, louder, richer, more alive. He was not content to sit as a distant ruler behind council tables. He wanted to be seen, to be watched, to be admired. Every room he entered became a stage, and he was both actor and director. Foreign ambassadors were stunned. Letters carried back to Venice, France and Spain struggled to capture the spectacle. How could one man sustain such relentless variety? He hunted until his dogs collapsed, then played tennis until the walls shook. He composed songs in the morning, debated theology in the afternoon, then feasted deep into the night before rising at dawn to do it all again. Where other monarchs were defined by their laws, Henry defined himself by performance. For courtiers, keeping up with him was impossible. They staggered in his wake, gasping for breath during hunts, stumbling through dances. Henry noticed and laughed, proud that no one could match him. Even rivals admitted his magnetism. He could charm a hall with a smile, silence it with a glance, and fill it with thunderous laughter, a heartbeat later. This was not mere charisma. Henry knew that kingship was theatre, and his body was the central prop. Candlelit masks starred the king himself, glittering in jeweled masks as he danced through allegories of conquest. Banquets became parades of food, whole stags, roasted, towers of sugar crafted into castles, goblets of wine heavy with gold leaf. They were not meals, but arguments, proof that his abundance was endless. Noise filled every corner of his world. Trumpets blared before his entrances, drums thundered before jousts, choirs swelled in chapels. Henry joined in, his tenor voice rising over the choir, as though no note belonged to anyone but him. He was not a monarch who observed. He demanded to be the brightest, the loudest, the center of every sound. The performance reached beyond palace walls. Public processions were staged with the precision of theatre. Streets in London were lined with banners, windows draped in tapestries, citizens climbing onto roofs to glimpse the young king riding in armor or cloth of gold. To the people, one glance was enough to seal their devotion. He looked indestructible, too vivid to doubt. Few could imagine that one day he would need machines just to move from chair to bed. At the tilt-yard, Henry's glory became ritual. When opponents fell back reeling, the crowd erupted. But each charge carried risk, a misstep, a splinter, a fall, danger, always shadowed spectacle, waiting for the day it would break him. Still, he demanded more. More tournaments, more feasts, more masks. He ordered palaces expanded, tapestries woven, plays written. The court became an engine, designed to magnify him. Every hunt, every banquet, every joust was not pastime but propaganda. Henry is idle, dazzling, untouchable. For nobles, the pace was ruinous. They strained their purses to match his magnificence, buying silks and jewels, sponsoring masks, hosting banquets in imitation. But none could match him. The gap was deliberate. Henry wanted to stand above them all, the man whose appetite and stamina no subject could equal. One Venetian envoy remarked that Henry seemed made of energy itself. That was the point. His body was his proof, his vigor, his crown. To see him was to believe he was chosen. And in those years, belief came easily. Looking back, it is tempting to read arrogance into the theatre, to imagine that his endless displays were already symptoms of something darker. Perhaps they were. Behind the glitter of masks and the roar of tournaments, the seeds of collapse were quietly taking root. The king who built his reign on spectacle would in time find himself trapped in another kind of theatre, the theatre of decay. For now he was the idol of England, dazzling, magnetic, a monarch who seemed immune to limits. But no idol stands forever. For more than 2 decades, Henry VIII had ruled through his body. The hunts, the jousts, the music, the dancing, all of it broadcast a single message. This king's strength was his crown. But in January 1536, the theatre of power turned against him. The setting was the arena where Henry had always shone brightest. By then he was 44, still broad in the shoulders, still eager for spectacle, but heavier, slower, no longer the golden youth who had dazzled Europe. He refused to let it matter. The lances would still shatter. The crowds would still roar. Kingship, for Henry, was as much about the show as it was about the law. On the morning of January 24th, he mounted his horse in full armor, visor lowered, lance braced. The lists were crowded, nobles and ambassadors pressed shoulder to shoulder for the best view. Jousting was more than sport. It was ritual, proof that England's monarch was still a knight, still a warrior, still the idol of his people. The signal was given, the charge began, hooves thundered, dust rose, banners flapped, spectators shouted, expecting the familiar crash and splinters. Then it happened, but not as expected. The impact came with a sickening crack. Henry was thrown backward, his armored body slamming into the ground. His horse reared, then toppled, the massive weight pinning him beneath. For a heartbeat the crowd cheered, thinking it part of the display. Then they saw he was not moving. The lists fell silent, 1,000 eyes fixed on the motionless heap of armor in the dirt. Courtiers rushed forward, straining to lift the horse, dragging the king out with frantic hands. Dust hung in the air, muffling sound. When they pulled him free, the horror settled. Henry did not rise. For 2 long hours he lay unconscious. England for that span of time was leaderless. Physicians hovered, helpless, whispering prayers as much as diagnoses. Ambassadors scribbled hasty notes, unsure whether to report a king alive or dead. Anne Boleyn, pregnant at the time, collapsed in fear when she heard the news. The entire kingdom teetered on the brink of chaos, all because one body, so long the pillar of power, had fallen in the dirt. At last, Henry stirred. He groaned, his eyes fluttered open. The king lived, but something in him had shifted. The physical wound was grave. His leg, crushed under the horse, tore open in an injury that never healed. Infection set in quickly, ulcers broke open, and refused to close, stubborn against every treatment his physicians attempted. Linen bandages soaked through, poultices of honey and herbs failed. From this day forward, his leg carried a permanent wound, an open reminder that even kings could break. But the deeper injury may have been to his head. 2 hours unconscious is long enough for damage. Modern medicine would call it a traumatic brain injury. Those who knew him best noted a transformation. Where once he had been exuberant, sometimes rash, but often warm, he grew unpredictable, suspicious, quick to fury. His paranoia sharpened. His cruelties deepened. Some whispered that the Golden Prince had not risen from the tilt-yard with him. Henry himself felt the change. His leg throbbed with constant pain, slowing his stride, making hunts and jousts less frequent. He could no longer charge with the same force, no longer dance through halls until dawn. Each movement reminded him that his crown of flesh was faltering. For a man who believed his body was his kingdom's strength, this was more than injury, it was humiliation. In public he tried to hide it. The feasts continued, the hunts were proclaimed, but those near him saw the truth. They watched him wince when he rose, pause when he walked, grip chairs for balance. They also saw his temper flare in ways it had not before. A careless remark could bring rage. A hesitant bow could trigger suspicion. The charm that had once filled the court gave way to menace. The accident became a whispered milestone. Some said the king's soul had darkened that day. Others noted that his appetite seemed to grow as his mobility shrank. He ate more, drank more, lingered longer at table. The man who had once burned energy like fire now sought comfort in excess. The tilt-yard had crowned him in youth, and it betrayed him in middle age. With each passing year, the body that had once dazzled his people became harder to disguise. Henry VIII began to swell. The waistlines of his clothes expanded until they no longer fit. New garments were ordered again and again, each broader than the last. His armor, once snug against a youthful frame, could no longer be buckled. The great suit of Greenwich plate made for him in 1540 measured over 54 inches at the waist, a gleaming shell, forged not for a knight but for a giant. Furniture too was altered to bear him, chairs reinforced with iron, beds widened to unnatural proportions, stools with heavier legs. The palaces themselves bent around their master's bulk. Carpenters and smiths labored not on art or weapons, but on thrones that would not collapse beneath their king. Even in the silence of workshops, craftsmen muttered about his size, though none dared say it aloud. His weight crept past 400 pounds. Soon he became too heavy for a horse to carry without risk. Processions that had once thrilled with the sight of a warrior king on horseback now relied on carriages. The spectacle of majesty had been altered. Once he had dazzled by motion, now he astonished by sheer immensity. Behind the scenes, servants strained. They maneuvered him with specially constructed contraptions, pulleys, winches, platforms that lifted his body from bed to chair. Sweat poured down their faces as they hauled ropes, knowing a single slip could cost them not only their positions but their lives. To fumble the king's body was treason of a physical kind. The great Tudor monarch, who had once seemed tireless, now required machinery to live from one hour to the next. He remained a presence, but no longer the same. Where once he dominated through movement, he now dominated through mass. His very bulk became intimidation, a wall of flesh dressed in cloth of gold. The banquets grew in scale as if to fill the void. Hampton Court's kitchens turned out rivers of food, oxen roasted whole, dozens of chickens, pies layered with meat and spices, puddings, custards, oceans of ale and wine. Accounts survive of his consumption, mountains of flesh devoured, tankards drained. Henry sat at the center of it all, eating with gusto, his appetite now performance. If he could not dazzle by lance or hunt, he would overwhelm with abundance. Those who saw him in these years were startled. The French ambassadors who had once compared him to Apollo, now described him as monstrous in size, a king who was carried rather than striding. In portraits, painters softened the truth with careful proportions, but even Holbein's brush could not fully disguise the mass. The famous Whitehall mural presents a monarch with legs apart, chest thrust forward, fists on hips, the stance of dominance. But beneath the grandeur lay the reality of a body made heavy by excess, held up by thrones reinforced in secret, and yet the court still bent around him. Nobles praised his strength, flattered his appetite, and pretended that his bulk was majesty rather than decline. To question his body was to question his reign, and few dared risk it. Servants carried his weight, craftsmen built his supports, cooks fed his hunger, and all the while the transformation continued. By the 1540s, Henry was less a man than a looming presence. To see him approach was to see a figure of immensity, clothed in silks and jewels that strained at the seams. He filled the space around him, a monarch whose size alone was a kind of intimidation. But behind the glittering fabrics, every step was a reminder of his confinement. The truth was inescapable. Beneath the silks and gold, the body that had once been England's pride was turning against him. He could not run, he could not ride, he could no longer fight. He could still command, still terrify, still rule, but his flesh was no longer his servant. It had become his burden, and that burden, as the years rolled on, would only grow heavier, until the body that had been his crown would become his cage. By the 1540s, Henry VIII was no longer only immense. He was unbearable to be near. The weight had made him slow, but it was the wounds on his legs that turned his presence into something people dreaded. The injuries never healed. Instead, they opened wider year by year, deep ulcers spreading across his calves and thighs. The flesh swelled, cracked and wept, soaking through layer after layer of linen. Servants who unwrapped the bandages reported pus so thick it clung to their hands, an ooze that resisted washing, no matter how hard they scrubbed. The task was repeated daily, sometimes several times. The ulcers refused to close. The smell was inescapable. It filled his chambers, clung to his bedding, seeped into the clothes of anyone who entered. It was not the musk of sweat or labor, but something sweeter, more rancid, the odor of infection eating through living flesh. Courtiers whispered of it drifting through corridors, long after Henry had left, staining the very air of the palace. At dressing ceremonies, once coveted as marks of intimacy, nobles shifted in discomfort. What had once been a privilege was now a punishment. To be chosen to assist meant kneeling at the king's feet, while flies circled, while bandages peeled back to reveal raw, glistening flesh. The groans of pain, the hiss of escaping fluid, the sharp tang of rot made strong men gag. Some carried pomanders filled with herbs. Others pressed kerchiefs soaked in vinegar against their faces. A few fainted outright. The kitchens and priests tried to fight the stench with incense. Candles of myrrh and juniper burned day and night in his chambers. Spice satchels dangled from bedposts. Crushed flowers were scattered across floors. None of it worked. The rot pushed through, stronger than perfume, louder than ritual. Henry noticed it in their eyes. He noticed the way men hesitated before approaching, how conversations faltered when the odor thickened. A monarch once praised for beauty, now saw courtiers struggling not to recoil. His pride, once tied to admiration, now faced the humiliation of disgust. Each flinch cut him deeper than the wounds themselves, but disgust could not be spoken. His physicians wrapped the truth in layers of flattery and silence. They told him the discharges were signs of balance returning, that the body was expelling corrupt humors. Poultices of herbs, honey, wine, all useless, were presented as cures. The ulcers worsened, but the physicians nodded and assured him progress was being made. None dared admit failure. To say openly that the king's body was rotting was to risk treason. The atmosphere at court darkened. Servants drew straws to decide who would tend to him, and those who lost approached with dread. Some, after days of service, developed fevers and sores themselves, fueling rumors that the king's sickness was contagious. Others resigned or fled, unable to endure the stench and humiliation. Those who remained learned to master their expressions, to mask gagging with bowed heads, to carry the burden of disgust in silence. Banquets became contradictions. Henry still demanded lavish spreads, roasted oxen, pies heavy with spices, goblets of wine. He sat at the center, dressed in silks and jewels, but beneath the gold cloth, the bandages were already damp. Courtiers smiled, toasted, and praised his vigor, all the while fighting the odor that rolled from the head of the table. The spectacle of plenty had become mingled with the spectacle of decay, and still the ceremonies continued. Henry insisted on receiving ambassadors, holding councils, presiding over festivals. Foreign visitors entered with expectation and left unsettled. Reports survive of envoys, noting the smell, the difficulty of approaching close enough to speak without gagging. They recorded it carefully, in coded phrases, not out of pity, but out of caution. Even abroad, it was dangerous to speak openly about the physical collapse of England's king. The pain was constant. He grimaced as he shifted in his chair, hissed as attendants tightened bandages, roared in fury when treatments failed. But humiliation weighed heavier. The monarch who had once defined himself by a perfect body, now had to be cleaned like a wounded animal. Each ritual of care reminded him that he was no longer admired. He was endured, and yet he refused retreat. He continued to dress in finery, to appear in public, as though nothing were wrong. He hid the ulcers under layers of velvet and gold, demanded that his subjects praise his strength, ordered musicians to play and courtiers to cheer. The lie had to be maintained. The king was whole, the king was strong, the king was divine, but the truth could not be hidden forever. The courtiers smelled it, the physicians knew it, the servants bore it daily. Henry VIII's body, once the crown of England, had become its open secret, a monarch whose majesty was rotting from the legs upward. The physicians of Henry VIII lived in terror. Their patient was not a man but a monarch, and a monarch whose body betrayed him daily. To heal him was impossible. To admit it was death. They kept their language careful. Every bandage change, every failed poultice, every bloodletting was wrapped in the language of humours and balance. The pus, they said, was proof the body was purging itself. The fevers were signs of corrupt heat leaving his system. The stench, they insisted it was the smell of healing. Henry demanded answers, but what he received was ritual. The truth that his body was rotting, and nothing could stop it, was unspeakable. In Tudor England, medicine was less science than ceremony. Physicians prescribed bleedings to release bad blood, purges to flush bile, ointments of honey, vinegar, and herbs to draw out infection. None worked. The ulcers deepened, the weight grew, the fevers worsened. Remedies became performances. Each new treatment was less an attempt at cure than an act of survival. Survival for the doctors who risked execution if their failure was named, and failure surrounded them. Rumors spread that attendants who dressed his wounds sometimes fell ill themselves, developing sores or fevers after weeks of close contact. The court whispered that the king's rot was catching, that to serve him was to gamble with death. Whether true or not, the fear was real. Physicians wrapped themselves in layers of cloth, perfumed their gloves, burned herbs in the chambers. Still the smell seeped through, still the risk gnawed at them. Henry's suspicion fed on this fear. He began to question his healers. If the ulcers would not close, were the physicians incompetent or traitors? If the fevers returned, were they poisoning him? If his pain grew sharper, did they wish him dead? A wrong glance from a doctor could mean imprisonment. A wrong word could mean the axe. The men sworn to protect his life now feared for their own. Some sought safer ground. They turned to prayer, urging the king to repent, to see his suffering as divine trial. Others recommended pilgrimages, charms, relics, not because they believed, but because such advice could not be proven false. Better to cloak failure in piety than risk Henry's wrath. Centuries later, historians would pore over the evidence, searching for a diagnosis forbidden in his own time. Diabetes has been suggested, explaining the thirst, the slow healing, the swelling flesh. Others see signs of Cushing's syndrome, a disorder of the glands that bloats the body and darkens the temper. Some whisper syphilis, the ancient scourge of courts, though the evidence is thin. What the physicians of his day saw clearly was simpler: infection without end, pain without cure, a body devouring itself. But they could never say so. The silence was enforced as tightly as any law. A physician who told the truth would be seen not as a healer but as a traitor, undermining the image of the king. Henry's body was England's crown made flesh. To confess that it was failing was to question the crown itself. And so, silence thickened the air alongside the stench. Behind closed doors, the doctors argued quietly among themselves, knowing their words could never leave the chamber. They tried poultices of rose oil, concoctions of mercury, even experimental lancing of the ulcers to drain the fluids. Each attempt failed. Each failure was masked. Henry demanded not honesty, but affirmation. The court itself became complicit. Ambassadors wrote home in code about his infirmities. Courtiers spoke of fatigue or rheums, never ulcers or decay. Even his wives were forced to pretend. Catherine Howard, barely more than a girl, endured his touch in bed while pretending not to notice the smell. Anne of Cleves thanked God for her annulment. Only Jane Seymour had died before the full horror began. The truth was forbidden, but the truth was obvious. Henry VIII was not only a king. He was a patient no one could cure, a wound no one could close, a body no one dared diagnose. The silence around him became as suffocating as the incense burned to mask his odor. The man who had once embodied strength was now kept alive by lies. Pain does not stay in the body. It seeps outward, shaping temper, judgment and rule. By the 1540s, Henry VIII's court was ruled less by law than by his moods. And those moods had sharpened into suspicion and rage. Those who had known him in youth remembered a man quick to laugh, fond of music and dancing, eager to charm. What they saw now was different: a monarch who erupted in fury at the smallest provocation, who turned on friends as quickly as enemies, who signed death warrants with a hand trembling not from mercy but from anger. The court lived in fear of his temper. Ambassadors reported that nobles lowered their eyes, spoke in clipped phrases, and never allowed themselves to disagree with the king. A single remark could be twisted into treason. A hesitation, a glance, even silence could be read as betrayal. The palace became a place of whispers, where men bowed deeply and prayed not to be noticed. Wives bore the brunt of this rage. Anne Boleyn had already fallen to charges, stitched together from paranoia and rumour, adultery, incest, treason, none convincingly proven, all sufficient for her execution. Catherine Howard, scarcely more than a teenager, met the same fate, condemned under a law written specifically to humiliate her, paraded as an adulteress before her death. Even Catherine of Aragon, once beloved, had been cast aside and left to die alone. Marriage, in Henry's court, was less a union than a trial by survival. Advisers, too, lived precariously. One year a man could be favoured, showered with titles, the next he might be dragged to the Tower, his head struck off by the very king who had raised him. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Henry's Reformation, was executed in 1540 on charges so vague that even contemporaries doubted them. Others fell in rapid succession, accused of treason, heresy, or simply of being in the wrong faction at the wrong time. The cruelty was not only political, it was personal. Henry demanded loyalty, while offering only terror. Courtiers flattered him with words of vigour and health. Even as the air reeked of decay, they praised his wisdom while watching him lash out in sudden storms of temper. They smiled and bowed, but beneath the ceremony lay dread. Every man knew that proximity to the king was both privilege and mortal danger. Suspicion filled the spaces between his pain. He began to imagine plots where none existed, to see treachery in glances and conspiracies in conversations. He ordered spies into households, informants into councils, even servants to watch one another. Fear bred more fear, until the palace itself felt like a prison where every wall had ears. The body's decline and the crown's violence became inseparable. His festering wounds left him short-tempered, sleepless, prone to sudden outbursts. Courtiers learned to read the signs: the way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes narrowed, the way his voice shifted before he exploded. To serve him was to measure every word, every gesture, against the risk of execution, and yet the image of majesty had to be maintained. Portraits continued to show a king planted firmly, hands on hips, glaring with authority. Pageants still staged him as supreme, sermons still preached his divine right, but those who stood near enough knew that the fury came not from divinity, but from pain. His rule in those years was not the steady hand of a sovereign, but the lashing out of a man at war with his own body. The executions mounted, the court thinned, and England learned to fear its king more than love him. Majesty had curdled into menace. The idol of England had become its tyrant, and the tyrant was a man who could no longer master himself. By the winter of 1546, Henry VIII no longer ruled through presence. He existed in fragments. The will of his council, the machinery of attendants, the weight of ritual carrying a man who could scarcely move on his own. The giant who had once thundered through tiltyards and forests, now spent most of his hours in bed, his frame too heavy for his legs, his lungs struggling under the burden of flesh. The court adjusted around him. Servants hoisted him from chamber to chamber in specially constructed chairs, winched him into position, shifted his bulk with pulleys. Guards followed not for protection but to steady the machinery. The sight was pitiful to some, terrifying to others. A king so large and frail that he required engineering to live from one hour to the next. At councils he appeared swaddled in cloth of gold, hands trembling as he signed decrees. His voice, once booming, rasped and broke. He struggled for breath after a few sentences. Yet the ritual continued. Ambassadors bowed. Scribes recorded his words. Nobles praised his strength. The lie had to be maintained. To admit the truth, that the king was failing, was to risk being accused of treason. Succession weighed heavily. Edward, his only legitimate son, was still a boy. Mary and Elizabeth, reinstated in the line by Henry's own orders, carried the stain of bastardry. Factions in court sharpened their blades behind closed doors, positioning themselves for the chaos to come. Henry sensed it, and it fed his suspicion. He named a council to rule after his death, hoping to bind the kingdom with structure, but he trusted no one fully. Every decision was shadowed by fear that others would seize what he left unfinished. His nights were worse. Fever left him shivering in sheets damp with sweat, his breath rattling in fits, his mind wandering. Attendants reported bursts of delirium, muttered commands to invisible soldiers, whispered curses against imagined traitors, sudden starts as though he saw figures in the room that were not there. The man who had once filled halls with music and laughter, now filled them with groans and mutterings in the dark. Priests urged confession, but Henry resisted. To confess was to admit weakness, to admit mortality. He clung to the belief that God had chosen him, that even in illness he remained set apart. Only in the final days did he yield, summoning last rites, though even then his words were guarded, as if afraid that surrendering his sins might strip him of authority in his final hours. The court held its breath. Few dared speak of his decline openly. Ministers and nobles tiptoed through each day, uncertain whether the next sunrise would bring continuity or collapse. On the night of January 27, 1547, Henry drifted in and out of consciousness. His attendants stood silently by his bed, some praying, some simply enduring the long hours of his breathing. In the early morning of January 28, the breathing stopped. The king who had reshaped England, who had filled it with spectacle and terror alike, was still at last. The silence was thick. There were no cries, no triumphs, only a release of tension that had stretched too long. After decades of awe and fear, the giant was gone. But even in death his body would not rest quietly. The death of Henry VIII did not end the spectacle of his body. Even in burial he commanded attention, not through majesty, but through horror. On January 31, 1547, his funeral procession set out from Whitehall. The king's corpse, swollen with gases and foul with rot, was sealed in a massive coffin, wood encased in lead, bolted shut, as though it were a fortress. The embalming had done little. His bulk was too vast, the decay too far advanced. Still, the ritual demanded grandeur. The cortege stretched for miles. Heralds in black, banners dipped low, bells tolling in every parish as the hearse rolled past. Priests swung censers heavy with incense, clouds of smoke drifting in the cold air, fighting a battle against a smell they could not conquer. Nobles rode in silence, but behind the solemnity lurked unease. Everyone knew what lay inside the coffin. Everyone wondered whether it would hold. The weather was bitter. The horses strained against the weight of the hearse. Villagers lined the route, some crossing themselves, some spitting in contempt, many craning for a glimpse of the spectacle. They had feared Henry in life. Now they wondered what would become of his remains. At first the procession held steady, then came the noises, groans, cracks. the muffled pop of pressure against wood and metal. Servants glanced nervously at one another. The king was restless, even in death. The rupture came suddenly. With a sharp crack, the coffin split. The gases that had built inside burst outward, and with them a gush of dark fluid spilled onto the floor of the hearse and onto the road. The stench rolled over the procession, rancid, overpowering, thicker than any incense. Men staggered back, gagging. Nobles clutched kerchiefs to their faces. Some retched openly by the roadside. And then the dogs came, stray hounds, drawn by the smell, lapped greedily at the blackened fluids seeping into the earth. To the courtiers who watched, it was an image from nightmare. England's once mighty king reduced to carrion, his remains consumed by animals on the open road. The scene carried echoes of scripture. Some muttered the words from Kings, "And dogs shall eat Jezebel in the portion of Jezreel, and none shall bury her." To them the prophecy had found its mark in Henry. To Catholics, it was judgment for his break with Rome, for monasteries dissolved, relics destroyed, saints cast aside. To Protestants, it was punishment for his half-measures, his refusal to go as far as reform demanded. To others still, it was simply humiliation. The man who had reshaped England exposed in death as nothing more than meat. The hearse halted, panic rippled through the attendants, servants scrambled with rags and buckets, blotting, scooping, trying to contain what had spilled. Straps were tightened, bolts hammered back into place, cloths shoved into cracks. The procession resumed, but no one forgot. Men rode in silence, holding perfumed kerchiefs to their faces, avoiding one another's eyes. The image of the burst coffin and the feeding dogs lingered like a curse. At Windsor, the burial proved no easier. The coffin was monstrously heavy, lead and wood together weighing thousands of pounds. Workmen cursed as ropes strained, and the great box lurched toward the vault in St. George's Chapel. The floor groaned under its weight, threatening to collapse. With immense effort, the coffin was lowered beside Jane Seymour. Even then, whispers spread that it hissed and leaked as it settled, as though the king's body still fought confinement. The official accounts recorded none of this. Chroniclers wrote of solemn dignity, of banners and prayers, of a monarch laid to rest in splendor, but those who had been there, servants, guards, villagers along the road, told another story. They spoke of the burst, the stench, the dogs licking at the king. They carried the tale into taverns and markets, where it grew in the telling until it became folklore. Henry VIII, the terror of England, brought low by his own corpse. The story endured because it felt true, truer than official pageantry. Henry had built his reign on spectacle, on a body displayed as divine. In death, the body betrayed him, and the spectacle turned grotesque. His last performance was not one of triumph but of collapse, witnessed not only by nobles but by peasants and strays, recorded not in polished chronicles but in whispers that refused to die. Even in his grave, Henry VIII could not command silence. His body roared in its own way, bursting, spilling, corrupting the rituals meant to contain it. The king who had once embodied power ended as a warning, his flesh insisting on a truth no crown could disguise. When the coffin was sealed in St. George's Chapel, the courtiers tried to breathe again. The giant was gone, the vault closed, the reign concluded. But Henry VIII refused to leave quietly. Power shifted instantly to the council appointed to govern for his son. Edward VI, a child of 9, inherited a throne too heavy for his frame. Behind him, factions sharpened their knives. Seymour against Dudley, Protestants against Catholics. Each man jockeyed for advantage, whispering Henry's name as if it could still lend authority to their cause. The king's body was underground, but his shadow stretched over every chamber of politics. Yet outside the halls of government, another Henry lingered, not the lawgiver, not the founder of the navy, not the reformer who had broken with Rome. Instead, people remembered the stories, the smell that filled palaces, the machines that hauled his weight, the coffin that cracked open, spilling fluids onto the road. For common folk, that was his true epitaph. Not statues or ships, but a carcass too large to bury cleanly. The contradiction defined his legacy. In portraits, he remained magnificent. Holbein's great mural in Whitehall, though destroyed in later centuries, had fixed the image in memory. The wide stance, the glittering garments, the hand on hip, the eyes daring anyone to defy him. Copies circulated, reinforcing the myth of a king, unshakable, unmovable, larger than life. But the whispers endured alongside the paintings. Servants told their children of the stink that clung to him. Ambassadors carried tales abroad of a monarch who reeked of death. Villagers along the funeral road remembered the burst coffin and the dogs. These memories lived not in gilded halls, but in fireside gossip, tavern tales, and muttered warnings about the cost of tyranny. For some, the horror was fitting. Catholics saw divine judgment, a body destroyed as punishment for schism. Protestants who despised his half-measures agreed God had marked him out. Others, less theological, simply laughed at the irony. A king who had demanded worship of his flesh was betrayed by it in the end. The truth is that both images were real. Henry VIII was at once the idol and the ruin, the golden prince and the stinking corpse. To reduce him to either is to miss the essence of his reign. He embodied the spectacle of monarchy in its fullness, its power to dazzle, its power to terrify, and its inability to escape flesh. His story lingers because it is not only about kings, it is about the body as theatre, the body that promises, then declines, the body that can command armies, yet split open in a coffin, the body that makes men believe in immortality, then robs them of it. Henry's life compressed that truth into one man, writ large enough for a kingdom to see. In the end, he was not divine, he was not eternal, he was a man of appetite, of wounds, of contradictions. His achievements, the navy, the break with Rome, the survival of the Tudor line, remain undeniable. But so too does the image of his end, a swollen corpse that could not be contained, a stench stronger than ceremony, a legacy as much of flesh as of power. And so the question remains for every age that crowns its idols: when we worship strength, when we mistake spectacle for permanence, do we remember that all flesh falters? Henry's reign warns us that the body will always tell the truth, no matter how many portraits or processions try to disguise it. The Golden Prince became a monster, the monster became a memory, the memory remains a mirror, held up to remind us that even kings rot. And perhaps that is why his story lingers, because in watching Henry's rise and ruin, we glimpse something uncomfortably familiar. Power still blinds, flesh still betrays, and I'm sure you can think of rulers today who wear the same mask of majesty, hiding the same decay beneath. It's a reminder that the power of image can turn overnight. One day a leader dazzles, the next they stink of corruption. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In the reckoning, Henry received what he deserved. His bursting coffin seen as divine judgment for a ruler who had more than 57,000 souls executed during his reign. And here's the cruel symmetry. His jousting accident struck him down in January. His death came in January too. Coincidence, or divine justice closing the circle? If you want more stories like this, tales of monarchs who dazzled in life and decayed in death, of crowns that glittered before they crumbled, make sure to subscribe to Shrouded History. Here the past is never clean, never polished. It is flesh, power, and ruin, uncovered in full. And tell us in the comments, which royal downfall should we uncover next?